Section 1. No doctors, no mercy. Falling sick in the Middle Ages. Close your eyes and imagine yourself waking up in a cold, damp hut in a medieval village. The walls are made of mud and sticks. There's no insulation, no windows, and a single hearth that barely keeps the chill away. You try to sit up, but pain claws at your joints. Your forehead is burning, your stomach twists in agony, and your breath comes shallow and slow. In our modern world, this would be a moment for medical help, an ambulance, a hospital, maybe even just a trip to the pharmacy. But in the Middle Ages, falling sick didn't mean getting treated. It often meant preparing to die. Medicine in medieval Europe was a mixture of superstition, ancient philosophy, and guesswork. There was no concept of germs. Bacteria and viruses were unknown. Instead, illness was thought to come from imbalances in the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A theory passed down from the Greek physician Galen. If you were sick, your humors were considered out of balance, and physicians would try to fix you by draining fluids, inducing vomiting, or purging your bowels. In other words, you were already weak from illness, and they'd make you weaker still. Let's say you had a fever. Maybe it's from contaminated food or a wound that's gone bad. A physician, if you could afford one, would examine your urine. They'd hold it up to the light, maybe sniff it. They'd compare it to charts that claimed yellow, red, or cloudy urine meant different things. Next, they'd check the stars. Yes, literally. Astrology played a major role in diagnosis. Your treatment could depend on whether Mars was in the right position. And what would they do to help you? Most likely, they'd recommend bloodletting. That meant cutting your arm open and draining your blood into a bowl. Or they might use leeches. The goal was to reduce the excess blood believed to be causing your fever. But of course, what it actually did was weaken you further, make you dizzy, and sometimes trigger infections. There was no understanding of sterilization. The blade might be used on dozens of other patients. The risk of death from the treatment itself was high. Now imagine you don't have the money for a physician. Most didn't. You'd go to a barber surgeon. That's right, the guy who cuts hair is also the one performing amputations, pulling teeth, and setting bones. His tools? A dull blade, maybe a bone saw, and a bottle of wine to numb the pain. There were no anesthetics, no disinfectants, no knowledge of anatomy beyond a rough idea of where the bones and guts were. The surgeon might wrap your wounds in dirty cloths, sew you up with a needle that's never been cleaned, and send you home. If the injury didn't kill you, the infection probably would. Let's talk about childbirth. For women, it was one of the most dangerous things they'd ever face. Midwives did their best with herbs, experience, and prayers. But complications, breech births, hemorrhages, or infections were almost always fatal. There were no cesareans, no forceps, and no pain relief beyond biting down on cloth or drinking ale. The chances of dying during childbirth were horrifyingly high, and even if the mother survived, the baby might not. Nearly a third of all children died before the age of 5. Diseases we treat easily today were often death sentences. A sore throat could turn into an abscess that blocked your airway. A cough might become pneumonia. A simple scratch could develop into sepsis. And remember, there were no antibiotics. None. Once an infection set in, it was up to your immune system and whatever herbs or poultices your healer applied. Garlic, honey, and willow bark were used and sometimes helped, but success was rare and inconsistent. When someone did recover, it was often considered a miracle. Mental illness was seen as either madness or possession. If someone heard voices, they were considered touched by the devil. They might be locked away, chained in a monastery, or subjected to prayers, beatings, or fasting to drive the demons out. There was no therapy, no medicine, and no understanding. People who suffered in silence were ignored. People who acted out were punished. Let's not forget leprosy. Known today as Hansen's disease, it was deeply feared in the Middle Ages. Those afflicted were often exiled from towns, forced to wear bells to warn others of their presence, and live in remote leper houses. The disease disfigured its victims and spread slowly, causing numbness and wounds that didn't heal. But instead of care, lepers received condemnation. They were seen as sinners cursed by God, untouchable. Then there was the church. Religion dominated medicine. Most people believed that sickness was punishment from God for sin. Healing required prayer, confession, or pilgrimage. not drugs or surgery. Monks and nuns ran many hospitals, and while they offered kindness and food, they rarely provided effective treatment. Instead, patients were prayed over, given relics to touch, and sometimes exorcised. Faith was medicine, and if it didn't work, you were told to make peace with God. Even the few medical texts that existed were dangerous. Remedies called for ingredients like crushed emeralds, powdered mummy, and viper's flesh. Mercury and arsenic were used to treat diseases like syphilis, often poisoning the patient in the process. Blood from virgins, ashes of burned toads, dog urine, these were all considered medicinal in the right doses. But what was the right dose? No one really knew. It was all guesswork. The worst of it came during plagues. The Black Death, in particular, revealed just how helpless medieval medicine truly was. When the disease struck in the 14th century, doctors fled cities. Priests refused to give last rites. People dropped dead in the streets. Some turned to strange rituals. Others blamed outsiders or accused women of witchcraft. Scapegoats were hunted. Jews were burned at the stake for poisoning wells. Witches were tortured and drowned. Panic ruled. And when your loved ones died, there were no refrigerated morgues, no embalming. The dead were buried quickly, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes burned. Entire villages vanished. No one understood why. They only knew fear. In the end, surviving the Middle Ages wasn't just about avoiding swords or starvation. It meant avoiding illness, because once your body broke, there was no one who could fix it. Medicine wasn't a lifeline. It was a gamble. You might be bled, burned, purged, or poisoned. You might be exiled, exorcised, or executed for being sick. And even if you found a kind soul to help you, their best efforts were still centuries behind what you'd need to survive. This was a world without science, a world where healing and harm were often the same thing, where hope came wrapped in prayer and sealed in superstition, where the weak were left to die and the sick were feared, not helped. Welcome to medieval medicine. Enter at your own risk. Section 2. The Machinery of Accusation. From Rumors to Inquisition. In the medieval world, few fates were as terrifyingly uncertain and irreversible as being accused of heresy. The process didn't begin in a courtroom or a church, but rather in the marketplace, the village square, or even the hushed gossip between neighbors. It was rarely a formal accusation at first. Instead, it started as a whisper, a suspicious glance, a muttered prayer spoken slightly differently, or the absence from Mass one Sunday too many. These tiny cracks in religious conformity could quickly become gaping chasms if noticed by the wrong person. And who were these wrong people? Often it wasn't a priest or a noble, but your very neighbors. In a deeply religious and rigidly structured society, deviation from the norm wasn't merely frowned upon, it was feared. Heresy was not just a spiritual error, it was a virus that could spread, infecting the soul of the community. To report a heretic was considered a moral duty, a righteous defense against the corruption of faith. And so, the machinery of accusation fed upon itself, driven by superstition, fear, envy, and personal grievances. A bad harvest, a sick child, or a string of misfortunes could all be traced somehow to that quiet, peculiar man who asked too many questions, or the old woman who preferred reading scripture to attending Sunday sermon. Once suspicion solidified into accusation, the machinery of the church began to turn. The medieval Catholic Church held immense power, both spiritual and political. It had the authority to judge souls and determine who would burn for eternity. But heresy wasn't just a theological issue, it was a matter of law. Monarchs, bishops, and inquisitors worked together to root out heresy like a weed from the garden of God. In this holy endeavor, they wielded both divine mandate and secular muscle. You might think you'd be informed that you were under suspicion. You weren't. In fact, secrecy was a cornerstone of the process. The Inquisition operated under a shroud of mystery designed to protect the integrity of their work, but in reality, it only fueled paranoia. An accused person was often unaware that proceedings had begun. Witnesses gave testimony in secret. Accusations were gathered without your knowledge. You might notice friends avoiding you, neighbors turning away in silence. By the time you were officially summoned, your fate might already be sealed. When the summons arrived, it was not a request. You were to appear before the church at a designated time and place. Failure to comply was considered an admission of guilt. Upon arrival, you would be detained, not in a jail cell, but often in church custody, sometimes even in monasteries converted into temporary holding areas. Conditions were often harsh, dark, damp, and confining. You might be held for days or weeks before hearing the charges against you, and when those charges were read aloud, they might be so vague as to defy understanding. Holding false beliefs, spreading ideas contrary to the faith, blaspheming the saints. The Inquisition did not require specific evidence in the way modern courts do. Testimony from anonymous witnesses, rumors, even dreams or visions were admissible. Your defense? Severely limited. You were not allowed to know the names of your accusers. You had no attorney, no advocate. You had only yourself and your interrogators. Interrogation was not a simple matter of questions and answers. It was a system designed to extract confession through psychological pressure and theological entrapment. Inquisitors were often highly educated, skilled in rhetoric and religious doctrine. They would ask the same questions in different forms, confuse you with Latin quotations from obscure texts, challenge your memory of sermons or scripture. A hesitation, a misstep, or even an inconsistency could be taken as proof of guilt. If that failed, there were other means. Torture. Yes, the use of torture was sanctioned, though only after obtaining permission from a higher ecclesiastical authority, and in theory only to encourage confession, not to punish. The reality, however, was far darker. Methods varied. The rack, where limbs were pulled until joints dislocated. The strappado, where the accused was hoisted into the air by the wrists and dropped suddenly to jar the shoulders. The iron boot, which crushed the foot. These were not punishments. They were tools of persuasion, justified by the belief that saving a soul was worth any physical suffering. And if you confessed, that didn't always help. A confession might earn you penance, a pilgrimage, a public flogging, wearing a yellow cross as a mark of shame, but it could just as easily result in being handed over to the secular authorities for execution. The church could not shed blood, so instead it turned the condemned over to the state, who would carry out the sentence, typically burning at the stake. Refuse to confess? Then the torture continued, or you'd be imprisoned indefinitely, or worse, you'd be excommunicated. This was not a light punishment. Excommunication meant you were no longer part of the church, and thus no longer part of society. No sacraments, no burial in consecrated ground, no protection from violence. You were damned in this world and the next. And let's not forget the act of faith, or auto fe, a public spectacle held in a town square where confessed heretics were paraded before the masses. These events were part religious ceremony, part entertainment, and part horror show. The condemned would be dressed in special garments, tunics painted with flames or demons, marched out alongside clergy, then tied to stakes and burned. The smoke was believed to purify the soul. The crowd watched in silence. Children were told it was necessary. Merchants sold food nearby. Life went on. But the damage was already done. Even a suspicion of heresy could ruin your life. Land could be confiscated, families ostracized, entire communities tainted. The Inquisition's records were meticulous, and its judgments echoed for generations. Many times people were tried posthumously. A man might die in peace, only for the church to later declare him a heretic, dig up his body and burn his remains to deny him any sanctity. And the saddest part? Many of those accused were deeply faithful. They weren't enemies of the church, they were its lovers. But they asked questions, read banned texts, or dared to seek a purer, more personal relationship with God. And in a world built on conformity, that was the greatest heresy of all. Being accused of heresy was not just a personal crisis. It was a collapse of everything you knew, your faith, your family, your standing in the community. It was a descent into isolation, humiliation, and terror. And once you were caught in its web, there was almost no way out. You might escape with your life, but you would never be whole again. Section 3. The Anatomy of Fear. Why no one was safe. The terror of being accused of heresy in medieval Europe wasn't confined to a few unfortunate individuals. It was a systemic fear, embedded into the fabric of daily life. The truth is, in an era governed by faith and fear, no one was truly safe. Even the most devout, law-abiding person could fall victim to the tide of suspicion. This fear was the true genius and horror of the Inquisition. It didn't just punish the guilty, it controlled the innocent. At the heart of this machinery was a paradox. Heresy was invisible until it was revealed, yet the act of revealing it could condemn you as well. If you spoke too freely, asked the wrong questions, or defended someone else too passionately, you might be seen as aligning with the accused. It was safer to stay silent, safer to point fingers, safer to blend into the crowd and hope the wheel of fate didn't turn your way. This atmosphere of paranoia led to the collapse of trust between neighbors, between friends, even between family members. In some cases, children denounced parents, husbands turned in wives, monks betrayed fellow monks. The Inquisition encouraged this dynamic. It offered reduced punishment to those who cooperated. Confession became a weapon. The more names you provided, the more likely your own soul could be redeemed. Inquisitors knew how to stoke these fears and used them to keep society in check. One of the most tragic consequences of this climate was the silencing of knowledge and intellectual curiosity. Europe, during the later medieval period, was beginning to rediscover the ancient works of Greek and Arabic scholars. New ideas about science, philosophy, and even theology were beginning to spread, but so was the suspicion that these ideas could lead the faithful astray. A scholar who questioned a traditional interpretation of Scripture might find himself on trial. A physician who used Arabic medical texts could be accused of witchcraft or apostasy. This fear extended into literature, art, and speech. Books were banned, libraries scrutinized, paintings censored. Even jokes about religion could carry fatal consequences. Public discourse was sanitized, and intellectual life became increasingly constrained within the rigid boundaries of orthodoxy. Universities, once bastions of learning, turned cautious. Teachers became nervous about what could be safely discussed. The pursuit of knowledge was not a noble ideal. It was a dangerous gamble. The role of inquisitors themselves is worth understanding in depth. Contrary to the modern image of hooded torturers, many inquisitors were highly educated men, scholars, theologians, and clergy. Some truly believed in their mission. They saw heresy as a disease of the soul and themselves as doctors trying to cure it. But even with this justification, their actions often crossed into cruelty and zealotry. The line between faith and fanaticism was razor thin. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, sometimes establishing temporary courts in cathedrals or castles. Their arrival was often preceded by a public announcement, a period of grace, during which heretics could confess voluntarily in exchange for mercy. But even this was laced with dread. If you confessed something that wasn't previously known, it might implicate others or raise suspicions about your community. If you didn't confess and someone else named you later, you were branded a liar and punished more severely. The records of these trials, many of which survive, are haunting in their detail. Testimonies were carefully written down by scribes. Confessions were often repeated under torture to ensure consistency. Every word, every nuance was cataloged. These records became tools for both instruction and warning. Future inquisitors studied them, communities remembered them. The names of heretics, even posthumous ones, were whispered for generations. And sometimes entire communities fell under suspicion. Towns where unusual religious practices had taken root, perhaps older folk customs blended with Christianity, could be targeted as a whole. In these cases, dozens or even hundreds of people could be accused in a single sweep. The Dominican and Franciscan orders, charged with enforcing orthodoxy, often led these purges. The trauma was collective, the scars generational. Fear also seeped into worship itself. Church attendance wasn't optional, it was survival. But it wasn't enough to simply be present. You had to show proper reverence. Kneel at the right moments, cross yourself correctly, respond with the right words, sing the hymns, avoid staring too long or too little. Faith became performance. A mistake could be fatal. The economic consequences were equally devastating. An accused heretic could have all property seized by the church or local lord. Families could be left destitute, children orphaned or enslaved. Merchants accused of heresy could have their shops destroyed, their guild memberships revoked. In some cases, false accusations were made simply to claim a rival's land or wealth. The system, though built to protect doctrine, became a tool for vengeance and greed. For women, the threat of accusation carried additional weight. While the church formally excluded women from priesthood and most theological roles, their spiritual lives were scrutinized closely. Women who practiced healing, read scripture independently, or showed strong religious devotion could be seen as suspicious. Mystics and visionaries, some of whom later became saints, often walked a razor's edge. Their writings were reviewed by church officials, and many faced accusations before being cleared or not. As the centuries passed, the church's focus shifted. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought a tidal wave of religious change, and the definition of heresy evolved. Now, entire nations could be considered heretical. The violence escalated. Wars of religion broke out. The Inquisition expanded into new territories, Spain, Italy, even parts of the New World, bringing with it the same fear and brutality. But the seeds of this madness were planted centuries earlier, during those quieter, crueler days when a man could be burned simply for believing the wrong thing in the wrong way. In a world without freedom of belief, without due process, and without the safeguards we take for granted today, being innocent wasn't enough. In fact, being too innocent, too quiet, too peculiar, too reflective, could be dangerous in itself. Because in a society ruled by suspicion and faith, nothing was more threatening than the mind that dared to question. Section 4. Trial by Doctrine: How Justice Turned into Theater. If you were accused of heresy in medieval Europe, your fate was no longer in your own hands. It belonged to a court that operated under a vastly different concept of justice than we recognize today. The heresy trials weren't designed to discover the truth. They were rituals of power, carefully staged performances where the verdict was often predetermined, and the goal wasn't fairness, but the reaffirmation of religious authority. First, let's talk about the setting. These weren't trials held in bustling courtrooms or before impartial juries. Most were conducted in private chambers or ecclesiastical halls, presided over by inquisitors acting as judge, prosecutor, and often executioner. You were not guaranteed a defense. In fact, you wouldn't even be told who had accused you. The identity of witnesses was kept secret, allegedly to protect them from revenge. But in practice, it also meant false testimonies went unchecked. When summoned, you were expected to appear before the inquisitor within a set number of days. Failure to do so was considered an admission of guilt. But even if you came willingly, the odds were already stacked against you. You would be asked to swear an oath on the Bible before God to tell the truth. Refusing to swear, that was heresy. Swearing and being caught in a lie, heresy. Remaining silent under questioning, you guessed it, heresy. The questions themselves were traps. Do you believe everything the church teaches? Seems simple. But if you pause to think, if you ask for clarification, your hesitation could be interpreted as doubt. Have you ever spoken to anyone who holds suspect beliefs? If you said yes, you risked implicating yourself. If you said no, and later someone testified otherwise, your denial became a lie, a heretical act. And remember, you didn't have a lawyer. The inquisitors were often highly trained theologians, fluent in Latin, scripture, canon law, and centuries of church decrees. You, by contrast, might be an illiterate farmer or a merchant with only basic education. The imbalance of power was staggering. Everything was tilted to push you toward confession, not because they wanted to know what you believed, but because the system demanded an admission to validate the authority of the church. If you resisted confession, there were methods. Torture was technically allowed only under certain guidelines. It was supposed to be non-lethal and used only when other evidence existed. But in reality, these rules were often bent or ignored. Victims were stretched on the rack, their joints dislocated. They were suspended by their arms behind their backs. They were pressed with stones or subjected to fire and branding. The goal wasn't just to inflict pain. It was to break the will, and it often worked. People confessed to crimes they didn't commit, to beliefs they never held. They named neighbors, friends, family, hoping that cooperation would lessen their suffering. Some even came to believe their own confessions, convinced by repeated suggestion and psychological trauma that they had truly sinned. These confessions were recorded meticulously by scribes. Once obtained, the inquisitors would proceed to the sentencing phase, which was often conducted in public. This part was crucial, not just for punishment, but as a spectacle. Heresy wasn't just a crime, it was a warning. The church needed everyone to see what happened when faith went astray. The most feared sentence was execution by fire. Burning had a symbolic purpose. Fire was seen as purifying, and the soul, even if damned by heresy, could be cleansed by the flames. It was a horrifying end. Victims were tied to stakes, surrounded by bundles of kindling and dry wood. Sometimes they were strangled or suffocated before the fire was lit. Other times they were burned alive, left to scream as the flames consumed them. Crowds gathered, clergy preached. The event was treated as both punishment and sermon. But execution wasn't the only option. Some were sentenced to imprisonment, often for life. These weren't modern prisons with structured cells and food services. They were cold, damp dungeons, often in monasteries or castles, where the accused might be chained to the wall, left in the dark, barely fed, and forgotten. Others were forced to wear symbols of shame, like large crosses sewn onto their clothing, or participate in public penance, marching barefoot through town, whipped, or kneeling at the steps of the cathedral, begging forgiveness. We must not forget that this system was self-perpetuating. The more people were accused and convicted, the more others felt compelled to denounce others in turn. Communities became machines of mutual suspicion, and even if someone was cleared of charges, the stain remained. Their name might appear in inquisitorial registers. Their neighbors would remember. Their children might be shunned or denied church rights. Innocence, once questioned, could never be fully reclaimed. This culture of accusation also allowed for political manipulation. Local lords, jealous neighbors, or ambitious clergy could weaponize the Inquisition to remove rivals. Land disputes could turn into heresy trials. Business competitors might suddenly be accused of blasphemy. Even kings and queens had to tread carefully. Monarchs who fell afoul of the Pope's favor might find themselves branded as protectors of heretics, with all the spiritual and political consequences that entailed. Over time, the machinery of the Inquisition grew even more complex. In Spain, it developed into a vast bureaucratic institution with thousands of officials, informants, and records. The Spanish Inquisition, infamous for its cruelty and reach, became a tool not only for religious conformity, but for ethnic cleansing, targeting Jews, Muslims, and conversos, converted Christians suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Its shadow stretched across oceans into the colonies and lingered for centuries. But perhaps the most tragic part of all was this. Many of the accused were not rebels or revolutionaries or even deeply heterodox thinkers. They were simply people caught in the machinery of a faith that demanded absolute conformity. Some asked too many questions. Some read the wrong books. Some had visions or dreams. Some simply refused to betray their neighbors. In a world where silence could be deadly and truth was defined by those in power, being right was irrelevant. Being obedient was everything. The heresy trials weren't about discovering deviance. They were about maintaining control. They weren't about saving souls. They were about enforcing submission. And in the process, they created a culture of silence, fear, and brutality that left scars across the centuries. Section 5. Heresy in the hands of kings, when power and faith collided. If you believe the church was your only judge, think again. In medieval Europe, religion and royalty were tightly intertwined, and being accused of heresy didn't just mean you'd angered a bishop. It could mean you'd crossed a king. The crown had a vested interest in stamping out heresy, not just to protect Christian orthodoxy, but to maintain political power and public order. And when secular rulers got involved, the lines between religious crime and political rebellion became dangerously blurred. To understand this, let's revisit the structure of medieval society. The king ruled by divine right, that is, his authority came from God. To question the doctrines of the church, therefore, was to question the foundation of the monarch's legitimacy. Heresy, then, wasn't just a spiritual threat, it was treason. Take, for example, King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. In the early 1300s, Philip became embroiled in a bitter power struggle with Pope Boniface VIII over who had the final say in French affairs. When Boniface pushed back against royal authority, Philip didn't just argue, he accused the Pope himself of heresy. He sent troops to arrest him, a shocking act at the time. When Boniface died shortly after, Philip influenced the election of a more compliant pope and effectively moved the papacy to Avignon, initiating the Avignon papacy, a period when the church became deeply entangled with French royal interests. This is important because it shows how heresy could be weaponized from above. Monarchs didn't just protect the church, they used its moral authority to justify political moves. And once the king and the church aligned on a target, the results could be catastrophic. The most infamous example of this power play came in 1307, when Philip IV turned his sights on the Knights Templar, a powerful and wealthy monastic military order. The Templars had grown rich from banking, land holdings, and influence. Philip owed them money. Rather than repay his debts, he accused the entire order of heresy. The charges were wild: worshiping idols, spitting on the cross, sodomy, and more. Under torture, some confessed, others didn't. But it didn't matter. Their assets were seized, their leaders burned at the stake, and the order was disbanded. It was one of the most blatant examples of heresy trials as political theater. This blending of church and crown wasn't limited to France. In England, kings used accusations of heresy to stamp out dissent, particularly during times of religious reform. When John Wycliffe and his followers, known as the Lollards, began criticizing church corruption and translating the Bible into English, they were branded heretics. Wycliffe escaped execution due to political connections, but his writings were condemned and his followers were hunted down. Some were burned, others were imprisoned. All were made examples of what happened when faith and politics clashed. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Inquisition became a joint effort between the monarchy and the church, aimed at creating a unified Catholic state. After centuries of Islamic rule in parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, sought to purge non-Christian elements. This led to the Alhambra Decree in 1492, which expelled all unconverted Jews from Spain. Those who remained and converted the conversos were still suspected of heresy and watched closely. Even nobles and royal advisors weren't immune. Heresy had become a tool of national identity, and the Inquisition enforced it with brutal efficiency. Let's pause and consider what this meant for ordinary people. In a society where church and state were one, to dissent religiously was to challenge the very structure of your world. If you questioned transubstantiation, the authority of the Pope, or the necessity of tithes, you weren't just a theological outlier. You were a criminal. The monarch could strip you of land, title, and life under the banner of holy justice. The interrogation rooms may have been run by clergy, but the torches, the chains, and the executioners often answered to the crown. Secular courts worked hand in glove with ecclesiastical ones, enforcing sentences and punishing those deemed dangerous to spiritual and civil order alike. In many regions, you could even be summoned by both courts, first to confess your sins, then to face secular punishment. This meant a double trial, and often a double sentence. Some monarchs were even more proactive. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Frederick II issued laws demanding death for heretics by burning, before the Inquisition had formally adopted the method. Heresy, to him, wasn't just a religious error, it was a civic disease. And like a plague, it had to be eradicated. Meanwhile, other kings were less enthusiastic. King Roger II of Sicily, for instance, favored religious tolerance and resisted pressures to adopt inquisitorial methods. But such rulers were rare. Most understood that aligning with the church gave them moral cover for their conquests, tax policies, and social hierarchies. When they persecuted heretics, they claimed it wasn't for political gain. It was the will of God. Of course, the people didn't always agree. There were regions like parts of Bohemia, Flanders, and northern Italy, where popular support for heretical movements was strong. Sometimes entire towns resisted inquisitors or sheltered dissenters. But once royal troops entered the picture, resistance became futile. Fire, sword, and excommunication followed. One of the clearest examples of this backlash was the Hussite Wars in the 15th century. After reformer Jan Hus was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415, his followers in Bohemia rebelled against both the Church and the Holy Roman Empire. What began as a theological dispute became a full-blown religious war. This shows how accusations of heresy could spiral into open conflict, blurring the line between spiritual authority and military conquest. In this climate, no one was truly safe. Priests, scholars, and nobles were accused alongside peasants and merchants. to question a relic's authenticity, to support a different translation of Scripture, to be friends with a known dissenter. Any of these could lead to imprisonment, torture, or worse. Heresy was not a single belief, but a moving target defined by those in power to serve their needs. And that's the most chilling truth. In medieval Europe, heresy wasn't just about faith. It was about control, control of hearts, minds, lands, and legacy. When kings and inquisitors joined forces, they wielded the accusation like a weapon, sharp, silent, and devastating. Section 6. The Inquisition arrives. Fear becomes system. If medieval heresy trials had once been sporadic and dependent on the whims of local bishops or monarchs, all of that changed with the arrival of a single chilling institution, the Inquisition. What began as a papal response to heretical movements soon evolved into one of the most feared bureaucracies in European history, an engine of suspicion, surveillance, and control that could reach into any village and accuse any person and dismantle any community in the name of orthodoxy. The first formal Inquisition, often referred to as the Medieval Inquisition, was established in the early 13th century, largely in response to the growing threat posed by groups like the Cathars in southern France. The Cathars had developed a complex dualist belief system, viewing the physical world as evil and rejecting the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. For the Church, this was not just incorrect, it was dangerous. The Cathars had their own hierarchy, refused tithes, and openly defied Catholic doctrine. They even had public support from nobles and towns. To respond, Pope Gregory IX appointed inquisitors, usually Dominican friars, tasked with investigating and rooting out heresy wherever it was found. These were no ordinary monks. They were educated, zealous, and granted extraordinary authority. They traveled from town to town, often unannounced, and held public sermons urging heretics to confess. Anyone who failed to do so could be summoned. Anyone who spoke up in favor of dissenters could be interrogated. Anyone who remained silent risked suspicion. The Inquisition wasn't chaotic. It was terrifying precisely because it was systematic. It kept records. It followed procedures. It developed rules for how to question suspects, how to evaluate evidence, and how to hand down sentences. But these procedures, though technically legalistic, were not fair by any modern standard. There was no presumption of innocence. Accusations were often made anonymously, and the accused weren't told who their accusers were. Witnesses could be unreliable, biased, or coerced. The accused had no lawyer, no jury, and little hope. Trials were secret, and the inquisitors were both the prosecutors and the judges. And then there was the torture. In theory, the church forbade the shedding of blood. In practice, the Inquisition got around this by authorizing so-called non-bloody tortures, the rack, thumbscrews, water torture, and more. These were meant to extract confessions or reveal accomplices. If a person confessed, they were encouraged to name others. And so, fear spread like rot. A single accusation could doom a village. Friends turned on friends. Families were torn apart. Once a confession was extracted, truthful or not, the sentence varied. First-time offenders who confessed and repented might be given penance, wearing distinctive clothing like the San Benito, a yellow robe marked with a red cross, pilgrimage, public humiliation. But repeat offenders, or those who refused to confess, were handed over to secular authorities to be punished. The church, you see, would not kill, but it would recommend execution by burning, the cleansing fire. The most notorious of these mass inquisitions occurred during the Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathars. In 1209, papal forces descended on the town of Béziers. When asked how to tell heretics from true Christians, the papal legate is said to have replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Tens of thousands were slaughtered. But as the decades wore on, the Inquisition only grew more sophisticated and widespread. By the 14th century, inquisitorial offices operated in France, Italy, and parts of Germany. They built prisons, they maintained archives, they developed handbooks on how to detect false doctrine, they trained officials in the fine art of suspicion, and everywhere they went, they spread fear. Inquisitors were required to be clerics, but they were supported by a wide network of informants, notaries, and assistants. These weren't rogue mobs. This was organized persecution. By the 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition had emerged, and with it came even greater reach and brutality. Unlike its earlier incarnations, the Spanish Inquisition was established by the state, not just the church. Ferdinand and Isabella created it in 1478 with papal approval, but it answered directly to the crown. Its primary target, conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Here we see the Inquisition mutate once again, not just a tool for protecting doctrine, but a mechanism for ethnic cleansing and social control. The Spanish Inquisition became infamous for public trials known as autos da fe, where accused heretics were paraded before crowds, sentenced, and sometimes burned alive in elaborate ceremonies. These were not just punishments, they were spectacles designed to terrify and awe. The Inquisition wasn't limited to the Iberian Peninsula. It reached into the Spanish Netherlands, into colonies in the New World, into Italy. Its methods were adopted by other kingdoms. Even the Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, was part of this same institutional trend, a cold, bureaucratic form of spiritual policing. And despite popular belief, the Inquisition never truly ended. Though the worst violence subsided by the 17th century, inquisitorial offices remained active for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't officially abolished until 1834. Imagine living in this world. A neighbor whispers something strange. You find yourself summoned. You enter a dark chamber where a monk with kind eyes asks you if you love God, if you've ever doubted the Trinity, if you've read any forbidden books. You stammer, you sweat, you say no, but your name is already in the ledger. The wheels have already turned. And once the Inquisition begins to move, it does not stop. It does not matter if you are innocent. What matters is whether you conform. The Inquisition made conformity a matter of survival, and in doing so, it extinguished countless voices, rewritten histories, and reshaped European culture for centuries to come. It was not merely an effort to protect the church, it was a grand, fear-driven system designed to control every thought, every whisper, every doubt. Section 7. Public spectacle and private terror, punishment, purification, and power. If being accused of heresy was terrifying, what came after the verdict was often just as horrific. A carefully constructed theater of punishment, meant not only to correct the soul of the heretic, but to publicly warn everyone watching, stray from the church's path, and your body and your reputation would be torn apart. Punishment in cases of heresy was never purely about the individual. It was social, it was performative, and above all, it was symbolic. Once a confession, whether coerced or genuine, had been made, the Inquisition's next step was to mete out a sentence. These ranged from spiritual penance to execution, but even the lighter punishments were often harsh and humiliating. A common punishment was to wear the San Benito, a yellow penitential robe, often decorated with red crosses or flames. In some cases, the heretic's name would be painted on the garment, or they would be forced to wear a large paper hat called a coraza, both items designed to mark them permanently in the eyes of the community. They might be ordered to make public pilgrimages barefoot, or to walk in procession through the town square, reciting their crimes aloud while the townspeople looked on, sometimes in pity, more often in derision or fear. Families of heretics were tainted by association, people whispered, merchants refused to trade, children were forbidden from playing together. And then there were the autos de fe, acts of faith. These were large, often festival-like events organized by inquisitorial authorities. They could take place in cathedral plazas, marketplaces, or other open spaces where crowds would gather. Entire towns turned out for them. The accused, sometimes dozens at a time, were led in chains before a tribunal where their sentences would be read aloud. Some were spared, condemned only to prison, fines, or public penance. Others were handed over to the secular arm because although the church would not shed blood, it would recommend burning at the stake. Burning was symbolic. Fire in medieval religious thought had purifying properties. It cleansed the soul, destroyed sin, and served as a terrifying reminder of hellfire. To the authorities, burning the body was justified if it saved the soul. Heretics were often offered one last chance to repent on the pyre. Those who recanted might be strangled before the flames reached them. Those who did not, those who screamed, resisted, or cursed were burned alive. Witnesses often describe the smell of burning flesh, the screams, the crackling of bones. Artists painted the scene. Poets wrote about it. Preachers used it in sermons. This was not something hidden in shame. It was displayed with pride. A righteous society defending its moral order. And yet, behind the public spectacle was a far more private, grinding terror. Many heretics never made it to the auto da fe. They simply disappeared. Locked away in the dungeons of inquisitorial castles like the infamous Torquemada cells in Castile, they were kept in complete isolation. Inquisitors developed psychological tactics to break them. Long periods of silence, sudden questioning at odd hours, being told of other prisoners who had confessed and implicated them, even if that wasn't true. And of course, there was torture. Though the church maintained that torture should be used sparingly and only when necessary, in practice, it was horrifyingly routine. The accused might be strapped to the rack and stretched until joints popped and bones cracked. They might be subjected to strapado, being hoisted by the arms behind their back and dropped suddenly, or have water forced down their throat through cloth to simulate drowning. Torture was technically not meant to cause death, but it often did, and those who survived were often broken in body and spirit, willing to say anything their tormentors demanded. False confessions were common, but the inquisitors did not view this as a failure. They saw it as divine will, a purification through pain. Even if a person was not burned, their life was over. They might be sentenced to lifelong imprisonment, often in cramped cells where disease and starvation finished the job the flames had not. If released, they were marked, not just spiritually, but socially. A record was kept. Their family's name was sullied. Their property, confiscated by the state, might never be returned. Because heresy wasn't just a spiritual crime, it was a civil and economic one. Accusations often conveniently followed political disputes, land feuds, or commercial rivalries. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy individuals to find themselves accused shortly after a disagreement with local authorities or clergy. Their property would be seized, their homes razed, their heirs disinherited. It was persecution wrapped in legality, spiritual warfare with a very real price tag. Even the dead weren't safe. In many inquisitorial proceedings, posthumous trials were held. A person who had died years earlier might be declared a heretic after death. Their body would be exhumed and burned, their grave desecrated, their legacy destroyed. Why? Because it wasn't just about punishing the soul, it was about erasing the memory of dissent, about showing everyone, not even death can protect you. What did this do to a society? It instilled a culture of silence, of obedience, of looking away. People became afraid to read, to question, to discuss religion in anything but the most orthodox terms. Books were burned, sermons were censored, communities policed themselves out of fear of being caught up in someone else's accusation. It fostered generations of trauma and repression. Artists, thinkers, mystics, all stifled. Science and medicine stalled. And trust, that most fragile fabric of community, was shredded. For the church, the Inquisition was seen as a necessary evil. Painful, yes, but essential to maintain unity and prevent schism. But for the people was a nightmare with no waking. A world where a careless word, a neighbor's envy, or the wrong kind of prayer could cost you everything. Section 8, Whispers and Watchers, the Inquisition's Web of Informants. By now, you understand that being accused of heresy in medieval Europe was often a death sentence, if not to the body, then to one's life, livelihood, and family legacy. But how did such accusations arise in the first place? How could a man or woman go from trusted neighbor to condemned heretic? The terrifying answer lies in the system of informants, a vast and invisible web of watchers, whisperers, and secret denunciations. The Inquisition didn't need to monitor every home or read every letter. Instead, it relied on ordinary people, your friends, neighbors, family members, even your children, to report on one another. This wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate design. Inquisitors often entered a town or city and announced a period of grace, a window of a few weeks where residents could come forward voluntarily to confess any heretical behavior and denounce others. At first glance, it seemed merciful. In reality, it was the spark to ignite a wildfire of fear. People rushed to confess the smallest infractions, speaking ill of a priest, missing mass, reading a banned book, interpreting scripture differently. Some confessions were genuine, others were desperate attempts to gain favor or avoid suspicion. But more sinister were the accusations. Inquisitors encouraged citizens to name names. Anonymous tip-offs were not only accepted, they were welcomed. There was no need for hard evidence. Merely being accused could lead to imprisonment, questioning, torture, and since the accused were never told who their accusers were, there was no way to defend oneself. Imagine this. You argue with your neighbor over a boundary wall. A week later, an inquisitor knocks on your door. You're told you've been accused of saying the Virgin Mary was just a woman, or that you skipped Holy Communion for a month. You deny it, but it doesn't matter. Someone, no one will tell you who, says they heard it. You're taken for questioning. Even worse, the fear spread into families. Husbands and wives turned on one another. Children were coached to report their parents. Parents warned their children not to speak about what happened at home, what prayers they said, what stories they told. Every word became dangerous. This web of informants created a culture of absolute paranoia. Some towns saw dozens of arrests in a single year. The mere arrival of an inquisitor was enough to send communities into hysteria. Public squares emptied. Whispered prayers became silent ones. Conversations about religion stopped. Even theologians, priests, monks, and friars were careful with their words, lest they be accused of embracing new doctrines. Those who refused to inform on others were themselves suspected. Silence was seen as complicity. Inquisitors believed that heresy was like a rot. It spread silently, infecting the community unless cut out entirely. And so even if you believed your neighbor was innocent, you had a choice: betray them or join them in the dungeon. Informants weren't always malicious. Many were genuinely afraid. The church taught that heresy endangered not just the soul of the heretic, but the entire community. Allowing it to flourish invited divine punishment: droughts, famines, plagues. So in some minds, accusing a neighbor wasn't betrayal, it was salvation. Others, of course, used the system for gain. A merchant might accuse a rival of heresy to remove competition. A spurned lover might denounce their former partner out of revenge. Landowners could seize the property of accused peasants. Clergy members could eliminate critics. And once an accusation was made, there was little hope of clearing one's name. Even those found innocent carried the stain of suspicion. Their names remained in inquisitorial records. Years later, someone might recall their arrest and whisper, "Wasn't he questioned by the church once?" That was often enough to doom a man's chances at marriage, business, or public office. This widespread mistrust and surveillance devastated social cohesion. Villages became fractured. Generations learned to hide their thoughts. The truth was a liability. Silence, a shield. The church, in its attempt to preserve orthodoxy, had created a society of masks, a place where belief was not lived, but performed. And yet many people did believe, deeply and sincerely. Not everyone accused was a heretic, but not every heretic was dangerous. Some were mystics, searching for a deeper connection with God. Others were reformers, trying to cleanse corruption from within. Some simply misunderstood doctrine or made statements born of frustration, not rebellion. But none of this mattered to the machinery of the Inquisition, because to the Inquisition, intentions were irrelevant. Orthodoxy was obedience. Deviance, even accidental, was punishable. You either submitted or you suffered. And so, through this vast network of surveillance, the Inquisition did what no sword or soldier could do. It entered the human mind, turned thought into crime, and made fear the foundation of faith. Section 9. The Trial. A performance without mercy. Now that you've been accused of heresy, whispered about by your neighbors, and dragged from your home by men in robes wielding divine authority, it's time to face the next chapter of your ordeal: the trial. But forget any modern notions of innocent until proven guilty. In a medieval heresy trial, the assumption was simple: if you were innocent, why were you even here? You are led, often shackled, sometimes hooded, into a dim chamber. Torches flicker against cold stone walls. At the center sits the inquisitor, sometimes alone, sometimes with a panel of clergy. Their role is not that of a neutral judge. Their job is to seek out sin and protect the church. You are the suspected infection, and the trial is the scalpel. You might be asked to take an oath to tell the truth as God is your witness. But what truth? You haven't been told the full charges. You haven't seen the evidence. You don't know who accused you. And yet the inquisitor's questions begin, swift and sharp. Do you believe everything taught by the Holy Mother Church? Have you ever spoken against the Pope or the saints? Have you attended secret meetings? Do you know anyone who has? Do you believe salvation can be attained without the church? They'll note your answers carefully. Any hesitation, any stutter, any deviation from accepted dogma could be damning. And remember, this isn't a conversation. It's a trap. The inquisitor is trained to lead you into contradictions, to twist your words into snares. Maybe you once said that God speaks to you in dreams. That could be called mysticism. Maybe you questioned why a corrupt priest lived in wealth while villagers starved. That could be considered rebellion. Each answer pulls you deeper into the net. And if you stay silent, it's worse. Silence was seen as obstinacy, a willful resistance to the truth. In the eyes of the inquisitor, it could confirm guilt. But what if you maintain your innocence? What if you truthfully deny every accusation? That's when the evidence is produced. Often hearsay, sometimes confessions from others extracted under duress. You'll hear that 3 townspeople say you claimed to speak directly to Christ, that you laughed during a holy procession, that your bread didn't rise after the blessing, a sign of spiritual corruption, some might claim. These witnesses remain anonymous, protected by the system. You cannot confront them. You cannot ask questions. You can only plead. And yet, some inquisitions allowed one brief chance for a defense. You could name mortal enemies, people who had reason to lie about you. If your accuser turned out to be one of them, it might weaken the case. But you had to name them before knowing who they were. It was a gamble few dared to take. If your answers don't satisfy the tribunal, and they usually didn't, you might be tortured. Torture wasn't technically supposed to be used as punishment or even a guaranteed step, but as a tool to extract truth. It had rules, at least on parchment. A confession under torture had to be repeated voluntarily the next day to count. But let's not pretend these rules protected anyone. You might be suspended by your wrists with weights tied to your ankles. You might be pressed with boards and stones until your ribs cracked. You might endure the strappado, hoisted into the air and drop suddenly, dislocating your shoulders. Or the rack, where your joints are slowly torn apart as you're stretched. Or you might simply be locked in a cold cell, deprived of sleep, food, or light for days. Under such agony, people confessed to anything. They'd admit to flying with demons, turning bread into snakes, consorting with heretics they'd never met. And if you confessed, the Inquisition wrote it all down. They didn't question how you remembered these events so suddenly. Once your trial concluded, the final judgment came, the sentencing. If you recanted, showed repentance, and weren't seen as a repeat offender, you might be given penance, public humiliation, lashings, wearing a cross-embroidered tunic for a year. Maybe, if your offense was mild, you were exiled or imprisoned. But if your heresy was seen as dangerous, or you were deemed unrepentant, or if you had relapsed after a prior trial, the outcome was different. You would be handed over to secular authorities. Because the church claimed it did not kill, it merely relieved itself of heretics. The secular court, now in charge of a convicted heretic, would pass the only sentence it ever passed: death. You might be burned at the stake in a public square, your tongue first pierced so you couldn't speak heresy while the flames consumed you. Or you might be hanged, or in rare cases, buried alive. Your property would be seized, your family dishonored, your name written into inquisitorial records as a warning to others. This wasn't justice. It was a ritual of fear, a pageant designed to terrify, to demonstrate the power of faith wielded like a sword. Even if you survived the trial physically, you would not walk away whole. You'd be ruined socially, economically, spiritually. The community might shun you. The stigma would remain forever. You were now one of them, the doubters, the dangerous, the cursed. And this could happen to anyone. You didn't have to be a philosopher or a radical preacher. You didn't even need to question church doctrine. All it took was a grudge, a misunderstood statement, a jealous neighbor, a priest with too much power. Because when the line between piety and paranoia vanishes, the truth no longer matters. Only survival does. Section 10, Aftermath. The price of survival. You faced the Inquisition and somehow survived. Maybe you confessed under torture. Maybe you recanted loudly and convincingly. Maybe you were lucky enough to have influential allies or a village priest who spoke in your favor. Maybe your heresy was minor, more ignorance than rebellion. Whatever the reason, they let you live. But living doesn't mean you're free. You walk out of your cell, emaciated, bruised, and broken physically and mentally. You've been shaved bald in places where lice had festered, your clothes replaced with a coarse tunic. If your punishment was public penance, you're led into the village square, barefoot and humiliated, a large yellow or red cross sewn into your garment for all to see. Everyone watches. Some avoid your eyes. Others whisper. A few scoff openly. The ones who once called you friend now stand silent. You are no longer just a man or woman. You are a former heretic. For the next year, or sometimes for the rest of your life, you will wear the penitential garment. You may be forced to kneel in front of the church every Sunday, barefoot, in rain or snow, asking for prayers. You might have to fast, abstain from all social gatherings, or even recite prayers out loud at intervals during the day. If the Inquisitor thinks you're insincere or still dangerous, he can recall you for additional interrogations at any time. And there's always someone watching. Neighbors report on you. Priests watch for signs of relapse. Even your own family may distance themselves. After all, if they're too close to you, they too could come under suspicion. Guilt by association is very real. But let's say you fulfill your penance. You wear the cross, you say the prayers, you work the land in silence. Still, your reputation never recovers. No one wants to marry a heretic. No one wants to trade goods with one. You are a social leper. Your children may grow up hearing whispers. Some inquisitorial records are permanent, inked into ledgers kept by the church. If you ever leave your village, these records may follow you. They are copied and carried across dioceses, shared between inquisitors. If you were a scholar or priest before your trial, your career is gone. You are barred from teaching, preaching, or holding office. Your books may have been confiscated, your home dismantled. Your ideas are now poison, even to you. Some break under the weight of it all. They flee to the wilderness, becoming hermits. Others fall into madness, tormented by the memories of torture or by guilt for having named others during their trial. And that's another cruelty. The names. Because under pressure, especially during torture, many accused gave up others. Friends, family, acquaintances who once shared a strange dream or commented too critically on a sermon. The Inquisitor would ask, "Who else shares your beliefs? Who attended the gathering? Who told you this doctrine?" To end the pain, you might say any name that came to mind. And the moment you do, those people become targets. Investigations begin. Trials multiply. The fire of heresy spreads, not because it's true, but because fear reproduces itself. Each confession is a new spark, and if any of those people die, their blood is on your conscience. It doesn't matter if your confession was coerced. You are still the one who named them. Some who survive try to redeem themselves. They turn zealot. They report others. They attend every mass and sing the loudest, but everyone knows. The stain lingers. True innocence can't be reclaimed once it's been publicly stripped. Then there's the matter of your property. If you were convicted, even partially, your goods might have been seized, land sold, animals auctioned. The church or local authorities keep the proceeds. Your family may be left destitute. Some wives divorce their husbands to save the family's name. Children might be taken in by relatives under different names. And yet, despite all this, people continued to live because they had no choice. They farmed, they prayed, they survived the best they could, hoping the Inquisitor wouldn't return. In rare cases, survivors of the Inquisition did fight back, not with swords, but with ideas. They fled to places more tolerant, perhaps to cities in Italy or parts of the Holy Roman Empire where alternate views could breathe for a while. Some joined underground sects, meeting in forests or caves, whispering forbidden scriptures by candlelight. A few even became martyrs later, choosing to die rather than renounce their beliefs again. But for most, the only way forward was silence. No more questions, no more criticism, no more doubts. Because to question, even in your heart, was to invite the Inquisition back. And you know what that feels like now. Section 11. The Inquisition expands from village to continent. You've survived the flames, the cell, the silence. But while you struggle to rebuild your life, the machine that almost consumed you is only growing. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the medieval Inquisition, once a scattered, localized response, transforms into a continent-wide campaign. And no one is safe. It begins slowly. After the early efforts against the Cathars and Waldensians in France, inquisitors realize they've discovered something more powerful than just a way to crush rebellion. They've tapped into a tool of mass control. Fear, after all, is incredibly effective, and so the papacy begins formalizing it. Pope Gregory IX issues the bull Excommunicaments in 1231, establishing the Papal Inquisition. Dedicated inquisitors are appointed, men with the authority to travel, investigate, and punish, free from local interference. They don't wear black armor or carry swords. They wear robes. They carry parchment and quills, but their power is absolute. Imagine, then, you live not in a rural French village, but in Spain or Italy, or even in parts of Germany or Bohemia. You've never heard of the Cathars. You've done nothing wrong. Yet rumors are spreading. The inquisitors are coming. They arrive unannounced, sometimes by horse, sometimes with a modest entourage. They carry sealed letters from the Pope, marked with red wax, giving them full ecclesiastical authority. Local bishops are ordered to cooperate. Town officials are required to assist. Resistance is not just discouraged, it's treated as heresy itself. Once present, the inquisitors announce a term of grace. This is your moment. You are encouraged to come forward, confess your heresies, and name your co-conspirators. Do so, and you might be forgiven, with penance, of course. Stay silent, and if someone else names you, you'll be tried as a liar, a blasphemer, a traitor to the church. The walls close in. Maybe you once questioned a priest's sermon. Maybe you own a book in a strange language. Maybe your neighbor's cow died the same day you gave her a sour look. That's all it takes. Because inquisitions don't rely on clear evidence. They thrive on accusation, and accusations spread like disease. Children accuse parents, servants accuse masters, rivals accuse each other for revenge. In one case from Aragon, a merchant accused a competitor simply to drive him out of business. Inquisitors didn't care. Every name added legitimacy to their mission. Every confession was a notch in their success tally. You might be brought in and told, "We already know everything. Just confess." Even if you haven't done anything, you hesitate. That's taken as defiance. Torture follows. By the 14th century, the techniques have become more systematized. Racks, iron boots, strappado, where your arms are tied behind your back and you're hoisted into the air, then drop suddenly, dislocating your shoulders. All legal under church law, provided the inquisitor doesn't shed blood or cause death. Loopholes abound, and even if you're never tortured, the mere presence of the Inquisition transforms your world. People speak in whispers. Books are hidden or burned. Artistic expression dries up. Intellectual life dims. Monasteries stop copying works that might be controversial. Universities remove teachers suspected of unorthodox thought. The brightest minds of Europe go silent, and as the Inquisition expands, it adapts. In France, it targets scholars and nobles. In Germany, it fuels a wave of hysteria that will eventually lead to the burning of supposed witches. In Spain, it transforms into something even more fearsome, the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, which targets not just religious dissenters but entire populations. Jews, Muslims, and converted Christians suspected of secretly practicing old beliefs. And here, heresy becomes racialized. Your bloodline is now under scrutiny. Limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, becomes a legal category. Being born into the wrong family, regardless of your faith or actions, can doom you. Children are questioned. Family trees are investigated. One ancestor, long dead, who was Jewish or Muslim, that's enough. The Inquisitions become more bureaucratic, more expansive. The trials are recorded in vast ledgers. Some inquisitors become celebrities, feared and admired for their zeal. Their names strike terror into entire regions. Bernard Gui, Nicolas Aymeric, Torquemada. And still, the average person just tries to survive. You go to church, you say nothing controversial, you pray loudly, you burn a heretic effigy when told. You avoid travelers and foreigners, you don't read, you don't write, you pretend not to think, because thought itself has become dangerous. And what of the church? Some bishops protested, to be fair. Some theologians argued against the Inquisition's methods, but their voices were drowned out. The institutional machine was too powerful. Heresy had become not just a spiritual concern, it was a political one. Kingdoms and popes depended on it to maintain order. Heresy was no longer just error, it was treason. And as the Inquisitions roll across Europe, century by century, they leave behind ruins, ruined lives, ruined knowledge, a culture increasingly shaped not by what people believed, but by what they were afraid to say. And the saddest part? Most of the so-called heretics weren't revolutionaries. They weren't threats. Many were simply curious, hopeful, or confused, people looking for clarity, for justice, for truth. And they paid for it. Section 12. The fate of the accused. What happened after the verdict? So the verdict has been read. You've been found guilty of heresy. Now what? Your fate, like so many others during the medieval Inquisitions, depends on several factors. Whether you confessed, whether you repented, and what kind of heresy you were accused of. But make no mistake, in nearly every case, even if you cooperate, you will never return to life as it was. Your reputation is destroyed. Your property may be seized. Your future permanently shadowed. Let's say you confessed during the term of grace, the brief window when voluntary admissions were encouraged. This is your best case scenario. You might be sentenced to penance, a pilgrimage to a distant holy site, wearing a special garment called a San Benito, a yellow sack-like tunic marked with crosses or even flames, branding you publicly as a penitent heretic. You must wear it daily, in the streets, in church, everywhere. Everyone will know. You will live as a walking cautionary tale. Now let's suppose you resisted the charges and refused to confess. The inquisitor might then claim your soul is in greater peril and order harsher punishments. This includes excommunication, essentially cutting you off from all spiritual life. No communion, no sacraments, no burial in sacred ground. To a medieval mind, this wasn't just a legal punishment. It was eternal damnation. But the worst fate? Being deemed a relapsed heretic. If you confessed but were later accused again, or if your repentance was judged insufficient, you could be condemned without appeal. In such cases, the church would declare you beyond its reach and hand you over to the secular authorities. This legal sleight of hand allowed the church to say, "We don't shed blood," while knowing exactly what would happen next. The state would carry out the sentence. That sentence? Almost always death, burning at the stake. The symbolism mattered. Fire was seen as purifying, a way to cleanse the soul even as it destroyed the body. You might be tied to a pole and surrounded by dry wood. If the inquisitor was feeling merciful, you might be strangled before the flames were lit. If not, you burned alive. The crowds would gather. Public executions of heretics became grim spectacles, less about justice, more about fear. Children were made to watch. Townsfolk whispered prayers, and everyone left with a very clear message. Speak no heresy, or this will be you. But the punishment didn't end with your death. If you were wealthy, your property could be confiscated. Entire families were reduced to poverty overnight. Widows and children were left destitute, forbidden from inheriting anything. Sons might be excluded from guilds. Daughters might never marry. Your name was blackened on legal rolls. Your bones, if buried, could be exhumed and burned posthumously. It wasn't just you who paid. It was everyone you ever loved. Inquisitorial records show this happening again and again. In Languedoc, entire villages were depopulated. In Aragon, family dynasties disappeared. In Italy, some inquisitors even issued purity certificates to families, documents proving no one in your bloodline had ever been accused of heresy. Without one, you might not be able to join a religious order, marry, or hold office. It gets worse. Some victims weren't even alive when accused. Posthumous trials were real. In one infamous case, a man long dead was exhumed, tried, found guilty, and his bones burned. Why? Because his writings had influenced others, or because a distant relative needed to prove loyalty to the church. History was rewritten, literally, with fire. And if you survived, if you were lucky enough to be released, you lived as a marked person. The San Benito wasn't just a garment, it was a sentence. Some were forced to wear them for life. Others were ordered to march in public processions, flogged as they walked, their backs bleeding under the stares of neighbors. You might be forbidden from working certain jobs, from living in your home, from associating with former friends. Some never recovered. They wandered from town to town, shunned, malnourished, slowly driven mad. And perhaps the most horrifying part, you could be innocent. Many were. Historical research has uncovered inquisitorial records that show cases built on nothing more than gossip or jealousy. People accused out of spite, out of fear, out of misunderstanding. They were ground into dust by the wheels of a system that did not allow for doubt or mercy. But what if you recanted? What if you tried to fight back? Sometimes that made it worse. In rare cases, those who resisted, not just the church, but the entire inquisitorial process, became martyrs. Some joined resistance movements. Others fled, living in hiding, writing secret tracts or preaching in underground circles. Their courage planted seeds. Eventually, centuries later, those seeds would sprout into movements like the Reformation. But in the medieval period, they were hunted, tracked, executed. You must understand, the Inquisitions weren't designed to uncover truth. They were designed to eliminate ambiguity, to draw a hard, unbreakable line between what the church considered right and everything else. And if you stood on the wrong side, willingly or not, you became an example. The fate of the accused wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a tool, a warning, and it worked. It kept people quiet. It kept minds closed. It kept power in the hands of a few. Next time, we'll look more closely at how these inquisitorial methods evolved into tools of broader political control, especially as we approach the height of the Spanish Inquisition. Section 13. The Spanish Inquisition, Power Politics and Pure Terror. If you thought the medieval church's pursuit of heresy was terrifying, wait until we reach the apex of institutionalized religious terror, the Spanish Inquisition. What began as a tool of spiritual correction evolved into one of the most politically charged and ruthless organizations in European history. It's here that the lines between faith, fear, and control blur completely, where heresy becomes a weapon not just against ideas, but entire communities. The Spanish Inquisition was officially established in 1478 by Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who had recently unified Spain. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, which were more focused on doctrinal errors among Christians, this one had a very different target in mind. Conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity either by choice or under duress. But here's the cruel twist. It wasn't enough to convert. The church now demanded proof that your conversion was genuine. Any slip, any retained Jewish practice, any rumor that you still prayed to Allah could be used against you. Entire families were scrutinized. Neighbors spied on neighbors. And once accused, you had little hope of clearing your name. This wasn't just about religion. It was about purity, not of the soul, but of bloodline. Spain became obsessed with the idea of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Having Jewish or Muslim ancestors, even generations back, could mark you as suspect. The Inquisition weaponized genealogy, demanding that people prove not only their own orthodoxy, but that of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. You were guilty by blood. Let's talk about the process. Once again, you were never told who had accused you. Secret denunciations fueled the system. Trials could last months, even years. You could be held in solitary confinement in complete silence with no access to a lawyer. Torture was used more systematically than ever before, always under the guise of saving your soul. And the interrogations, they were dark masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Inquisitors were trained to spot signs of lying, to confuse and trap you. A wrong word, a contradiction, a moment of hesitation. That's all it took. And because you never knew what the evidence against you was, defending yourself was nearly impossible. If you confessed, either under torture or to save yourself, you might be spared execution. But again, the price was high. Public humiliation, financial ruin, lifelong penance. And your name would still be recorded in the Inquisition's ledger of shame, known as the Libro Verde. But if you didn't confess, if you were judged unrepentant, the auto da fe awaited. The auto da fe, or act of faith, was the Inquisition's most dramatic display of power. These were public ceremonies where sentences were read and carried out. Sometimes they were staged like religious festivals, crowds, music, prayers. But at their heart, they were scenes of horror. Prisoners in San Benitos, chained and trembling, were paraded before the masses. Some were whipped, others mutilated. And the condemned, those judged beyond redemption, were marched to the quemadero, the place of burning. The flames weren't just a punishment, they were a theological statement. Heresy, said the Inquisition, was a contagion. It had to be eradicated by fire, like a plague from the soul of Christendom. And who were the victims? Yes, conversos made up a large portion early on, but soon the net widened. Anyone could fall in. Wealthy nobles accused by jealous rivals, political dissidents dressed up as heretics, women accused of sorcery, even priests and monks if their teaching strayed from the official line. It became a tool for royal control, allowing the crown to eliminate enemies while claiming divine mandate. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish Inquisition was a state within a state. Its tribunals spanned the empire, from Seville to Mexico City. Its network of spies was unmatched, and its records were meticulous. Today, we have tens of thousands of trial transcripts showing just how methodically this terror machine operated. But here's the part often forgotten. Many were innocent. We see records of peasants accused of not crossing themselves properly, of women tried for uttering strange words while giving birth, of scholars condemned for owning forbidden books, of children denounced by their own parents because the church encouraged it. The psychological damage was immense. Families torn apart, entire towns living in fear. Creativity, inquiry, and dissent silenced under the shadow of the cross. Spain, once a beacon of intellectual vibrancy under Islamic rule, descended into a suffocating orthodoxy. And still, the Inquisition persisted. Even as the Enlightenment spread across Europe in the 1700s, even as philosophers preached reason and freedom, the Inquisition remained, a dark relic of absolutist power. It wasn't officially abolished in Spain until 1834. That's right, the Spanish Inquisition lasted over 350 years. So why do we remember it? Because it stands as a warning, a reminder of what happens when faith is wielded as a weapon, when fear replaces justice, when truth is no longer something to be discovered, but something to be dictated. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about burning books and bodies. It was about controlling minds, erasing diversity, and ensuring obedience at all costs. In our next section, we'll examine how other inquisitions, like those in Italy and Portugal, followed suit, and how this network of religious persecution eventually unraveled under the weight of its own contradictions. Section 14. The Fall of the Inquisition, Enlightenment Resistance, and the Death of Fear. By the time the Enlightenment began to sweep across Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries, the ideological bedrock of institutions like the Inquisition began to crack, and as philosophies of reason, liberty, and individual conscience took root, the world slowly started to push back against the long, suffocating shadow of religious persecution. But that push wasn't simple or immediate. The Inquisition didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It eroded, piece by painful piece, as the world changed around it. Still, for millions, the fear it had sown was so deeply embedded that its legacy would linger far beyond its official demise. Let's begin with the intellectual shift. During the Middle Ages, the authority of the church was largely unchallenged. Truth came from Scripture, enforced by clergy, and deviation was dangerous. But with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, truth became something that could be tested, observed, and reasoned. Figures like Voltaire, Spinoza, and John Locke began questioning religious dogma, advocating for tolerance and freedom of thought. Their writings spread like wildfire, even in countries with strict censorship. The idea that someone could be punished for their beliefs began to seem not just cruel, but irrational. This posed a direct threat to the Inquisition's very foundation. At the same time, the Protestant Reformation had already fractured Christendom, and though Protestants had their own forms of intolerance, the religious monopoly of the Catholic Church had ended. In places like England, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, alternative visions of Christianity flourished, and from those regions came fierce criticisms of the Inquisition. Protestant propaganda painted the Inquisition as the ultimate symbol of Catholic tyranny. Pamphlets, woodcuts, and sermons described dungeons, torture chambers, and pyres. Some were exaggerated, but many were horrifyingly accurate. The image of the hooded inquisitor, faceless and merciless, became a fixture in the European imagination. Spain and Portugal, however, clung tightly to their inquisitions. The Spanish Inquisition in particular remained deeply entrenched in the monarchy, serving not just religious but also political functions. Yet even in those countries, resistance grew. Books became weapons. Philosophers, ex-priests, and even some clergy began writing anonymously against the abuses of the church. Some mocked the Inquisition through satire, others exposed its injustices through memoirs and leaked trial records. The printing press, once feared for its ability to spread heresy, now turned the tide against the inquisitors themselves. Then came the political revolutions. The French Revolution in 1789 was a watershed moment. It violently overthrew monarchy and church authority, declaring liberty of conscience a fundamental right. Churches were desecrated, priests hunted, and inquisitorial offices dismantled. France became a secular republic, inspiring similar movements across Europe. In Spain, liberal thinkers began pressing for reform. Some called for the abolition of the Inquisition outright. There were fits and starts, moments when it was suppressed, only to return under more conservative rulers. But the writing was on the wall. Finally, in 1834, under the regency of Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, the Spanish Inquisition was formally abolished. Its archives, vast and damning, were partially open to scholars. What they found was staggering. Over 300,000 trials, tens of thousands of executions, and countless ruined lives. The Portuguese Inquisition, too, collapsed under liberal pressure, ending officially in 1821. Italy's Inquisition survived longer under papal authority, but they too gradually lost power as the Italian states moved toward unification and secular governance. But even as the Inquisitions fell, their legacy endured. Whole communities, especially Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and so-called witches, had been devastated by centuries of persecution. The trauma passed down generations. In Spain and Portugal, Converso families continued to live in fear, hiding their ancestry, whispering prayers in secret even long after the flames had died. Even modern totalitarian regimes, from Stalinist Russia to the Khmer Rouge, have echoed inquisitorial logic, secret denunciations, show trials, re-education, and public executions. The methods of the Inquisition didn't vanish. They mutated, adopted by secular ideologies with similar goals, obedience through terror. And yet we can trace a strange paradox in this history. The Inquisition, which sought to purify society by eradicating dissent, ended up fueling the very ideas it feared. It created martyrs. It inspired rebels. It provoked thinkers to imagine a world where truth wasn't dictated, but discovered. And in doing so, it helped usher in the modern age. The question now becomes, what have we learned? That fear is a powerful tool, but a dangerous one. That belief, when weaponized, can justify unimaginable cruelty, and that institutions claiming moral authority must always be held accountable, because history has shown us what happens when they aren't. In our final section, we'll look at the afterlife of the Inquisition, how it's remembered today, misunderstood, and sometimes even defended. We'll examine the myths and realities and ask why, centuries later, the word Inquisition still holds such power. Section 15. The Legacy of the Inquisition. Memory, myth, and the lessons we still haven't learned. Even though the last official inquisitorial fires were extinguished nearly 2 centuries ago, the Inquisition lives on, not as a functioning institution, but as a powerful symbol. Its ghost continues to shape how we think about religion, justice, and power. It haunts history books, courtroom dramas, and political speeches. But what exactly is this legacy? And why even today does the word Inquisition still send chills down our spines? To begin, we must separate myth from reality. Over the years, the Inquisition has been exaggerated in both directions. Some apologists downplay it as a necessary evil of its time, a reaction to social instability or heretical chaos. They point out that secular courts of the same period were often just as brutal. Others inflate the Inquisition's death toll to millions, picturing mass torture chambers and citywide burnings that never quite happened. The truth lies somewhere in between, and it's no less horrifying for being accurate. While the Spanish Inquisition executed perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people over its existence, It investigated and terrorized hundreds of thousands more. The fear, control, and surveillance it enforced were its true weapons, not the number of bodies, but the number of minds it conquered. People didn't need to be tortured or burned to be crushed. Many simply disappeared. Others lived under suspicion for life. Families were torn apart by accusations. Entire communities silenced themselves. It's this psychological violence that makes the Inquisition so chilling. It didn't just kill. It made people complicit in their own suppression. It turned neighbors into informants. It normalized paranoia. And it taught generations that truth was dangerous, individuality was a threat, and salvation came only through submission. In some parts of Europe, particularly in Spain and Portugal, the archives of the Inquisition remain points of both historical fascination and deep national trauma. Scholars have used them to reconstruct the everyday lives of the accused: women who practiced folk healing, Jews who lit Sabbath candles in basements, young men who doubted the Trinity, priests who fell in love. Their stories, meticulously recorded by their interrogators, are heartbreaking, complex, and profoundly human. But outside academic circles, the Inquisition is often reduced to a cartoonish villain, used to score political points or fuel conspiracy theories. Anti-Catholic propaganda in the 19th and early 20th centuries leaned heavily on Inquisition imagery, painting the church as irredeemably tyrannical. Today, online debates often invoke the Inquisition to discredit religious institutions wholesale, sometimes ignoring historical nuance. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Inquisition's legacy is how relevant it still feels, because we haven't outgrown the urge to punish people for what they believe. In many parts of the world today, blasphemy laws remain in place, used to silence dissent, imprison activists, or justify mob violence. People are still jailed, tortured, and executed for speaking their minds, changing religions, or questioning dogma. Authoritarian regimes continue to use the language of purity, loyalty, and protection to justify surveillance and repression. We've simply modernized the methods. Instead of inquisitors in robes, we have bureaucrats and police. Instead of heresy, we speak of threats to national security or social harmony. But the mechanisms, the interrogations, the secret informants, the forced confessions, the public shaming remain eerily familiar. The lesson of the Inquisition, then, is not just about religion. It's about power and how institutions use fear to maintain control. It's about what happens when truth is monopolized, when doubt becomes a crime, and when the individual is crushed beneath the weight of collective orthodoxy. It's also about the resilience of the human spirit. For every person silenced, another found a way to speak. For every truth suppressed, another surfaced. For every institution that tried to freeze the world in place, there were visionaries who imagined something freer, kinder, and more just. Today, the word Inquisition still evokes dread, but also warning. It reminds us that persecution doesn't always wear obvious armor. It can come wrapped in robes of righteousness, clothed in the language of safety, or whispered behind closed doors. It can be slow, invisible, polite, and that's why we remember. Because history doesn't repeat, it echoes. And if we stop listening, we risk letting the next Inquisition creep in quietly, welcomed by those who believe they're doing the right thing. So the next time you hear someone speak with absolute certainty, or see power wielded without accountability, or witness belief used as a weapon, remember the past. Remember the dungeons beneath the monastery, the stake in the town square, the man who whispered under his breath before they gagged him. And remember that no institution, no matter how holy it claims to be, is immune to corruption. The Inquisition may be gone, but the danger it represents, that still lives.